This is Soledad Gutiérrez, Chief Curator of TVA 21 and Content Manager of TVA 21 on Stage. I'm today with Sim Chi Yin, a Singaporean artist whose research-based practice is very much connected to images in many forms, like moving images, like intervention on archives, text-based performances, and that the main aim of her work is placing a focus on history, conflict, memory, and extraction, but trying to open those gaps in those stories of how the official history has told us different events. We will get into the main ones he's been focusing on the last years and how those histories could be retold or re-narrated in order to open and to give name to many of the people that were part of them or took part on them. And that I think this is one of the biggest challenges of her work, naming and giving life to those voices that were hidden or not listening at the time. So thank you very much for joining. And I would like to maybe ask you, the first thing is, I've done a brief introduction on your work, but maybe there is a way of how you approach this research-based practice, and why did you start it? Because there is a personal story behind that moved you into that path, and I would very much appreciate if you could tell us more.
Yeah, thank you very much, Soledad, and thank you also for the commission that allowed me to make this new work. My research into this particular project on the anti-colonial conflict in what was then British Malaya started from a very personal place. My paternal grandfather was involved in this conflict as an anti-colonial activist and intellectual, and he subsequently was deported from Malaya to China by the British for this, and eventually he was executed in China soon after arriving. The interesting thing was that he then became taboo in his own family. We didn't talk about him for more than 60 years until I started being very curious about my own story and where I had come from and why this man was not memorialized in any way in our family. There was never a photograph of him in the house, and my grandmother's gravestone doesn't bear his name. And so I started to ask many questions about who this person was, and I wanted basically to understand what he did, why he made the choices he did. And then that kind of led me down this road to discover his whole generation of anti-colonial activists and fighters who then I understood had not been properly documented officially or unofficially before. So I kind of then decided to make this a big research project that looks at all these voices on the left. Because as we know, during the Cold War, there was a side that won and a side that lost. And oftentimes, as the cliche goes, the victors wrote the history. And in the former metropole of Britain, as well as the former colonies of what are now Malaysia and Singapore, there is the official verdict on this particular war, which is that, you know, it was a very successful smashing of a communist insurgency. And that the communists were basically terrorists who were sabotaging the colonial economy and setting up obstacles to independence. But that's the story we were told. But I think the story is a lot more complicated than that. And so this has become an almost 10-year research project from which I've started to make multiple artistic works from, including photographic and filmic installations, books, and performance lectures. And it keeps going. So I keep making more and more pieces from it.
Out of this research, I mean, there are like two terms that to me are really important, and I think that has been key to you in this process. No, you are speaking about telling the story of one side, and what's the role of memory? No, how memory can work and can be, or the attempt to rewrite memory or to create a new memory. No, because when we speak about how this fight was told from one side, that normally happens. No, the vendors try and sell one story, but also how much, I mean, that conflict was never memorialized in the history of the region, no? How it was hidden in a kind of, on this almost revolt, no? That was controlled, but it lasted many years. It involved like many countries. So it wasn't like an easygoing fight. So it was a long-term conflict that was never Cold War because of many issues with also global economies like the insurance. So it's trying to give or rename many of the aspects that have been officially told.
Yeah.
So that would be one side of the question. And the other side of the question is like, you have been working with archives. And I was wondering about one thing or one sentence or one name that Ariela Sulai speaks when she speaks about images, and is the power of the image. You know, how during the conflict, the images that were taken to create the narrative you are trying to rewrite. And how is the artistic process helping you to work with those images and make open gaps and windows to be able to tell at least the other side of the story?
So the first really is that this war in Malaya is really kind of like a forgotten piece of the global Cold War history. I mean, many countries were involved, as you say, and in fact, it was the longest conflict overseas that the British were involved in after World War II. But we barely hear about it, and we barely, remember it. I mean, even Brits that I've met of various generations, unless they had a family member who was old enough to have been posted out to Malaya, they've never heard of this war. They didn't even know that, they participated in this war. But Malaya is, I think, an understated war of more significance than we give it, at least in one or two ways, which is that it became a template for how a counterinsurgency should be conducted. It was put into the military manuals of both the British and the Americans on this is how you conduct a successful counterinsurgency. And I'm told by war studies experts that it informed the strategies of British and the Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan, which are much more recent wars that are in our kind of recent memory. The other way in which Malaya was significant is that the British actually piloted strategies that the Americans later emulated in the much more well-remembered Vietnam War. So, for instance, the use of Agent Orange was first pioneered or tested by the British in Malaya before it was used on a much larger scale in Vietnam. And the so-called strategic Hamlet strategy that the Americans later used in Vietnam as well was also first tested by the Brits in Malaya. As to the second part of your question, in working in the archives, I mean, this is a complex question, obviously. I do see my overall work in this project as multiple modes of archiving and counter-archiving this conflict. I mean, even in the chapter of the work, which is titled Remnants, where I'm really making very kind of dreamy, surreal landscape photographs of the sites of memory in this war. I mean, I also see that as a form of archiving, because that's working with the idea that the land itself could be an unspoken archive. And I'm looking for the traces of this conflict in the land. And then there's obviously the more straightforward forms of archiving, where I've done oral history interviews with 35 former anti-British fighters, and I've recorded their stories, I've photographed their objects from that time, and then I've also recorded their songs and made that into like a 2-channel video installation. And then there's the literal looking in the colonial archive and reinterpreting it by photographing these archival prints on a light table, causing a kind of seepage of the captions and markings on the backs of those prints into the front of the print. So it's kind of like an in-camera collage. It's been interesting, but also kind of frustrating for me because, I mean, as you note, I'm trying to re-narrate this war from the other side, but I'm having to resort to using imagery from the colonial archive. And we know how problematic those types of images are. So in shining a light and causing this in-camera collage, the least I'm trying to do is to try and reveal the layers in the colonial archive and ask questions of what is an archive? Who made those decisions to put things in and out of this collection? And who then used the wax pencil to do all this kind of different systems of indexing, because the different index numbers that you can see coming across in the images. And then also who chose these words to use in the captioning of these particular images, and what work did those images do at the time? And the answer to that is either propaganda or intelligence. And what work do these images do now in this reactivated form that I've created? The frustration for me comes from the knowledge that we can't use the master's tools to smash the master's house. It just doesn't work. I mean, but I feel like I'm using these colonial imagery in concert with these other elements that I've made and I've collected. And so it's one piece of a bigger puzzle in re-narrating this war. I'm interested in those gaps and those silences in the archive and across the generations. I think that has become quite a generative space for me, and which is why I'm going into a more speculative form of making with this video installation that I've created for stage, as well as a new piece of work that I've made on another commission. The work starts to depart from the purely documentary and it goes into a kind of space of imagination. Because as we know, and as you've noted, memory itself is full of gaps and inconsistencies and is unreliable. But I'm totally aware of that in doing the oral histories. My training was actually in history. My first 2 degrees were in history, and in academic, scholarly, historical work, you are looking at what's in the document archive and you're writing based on those pieces of evidence. But I've really come to sort of see that there are a lot of problems with that methodology. And I'm now more interested in opening up the spaces that are in between those documents, that are in between those alleged, those pieces of alleged evidence. Because, I mean, we're talking 70 years after the conflict. And I mean, none of it is reliable. But it is still interesting to see how people remember it. And I see my work as a kind of memory work itself, as well as some kind of resisting the official historiography and sort of asking questions of how is it we remember these wars? Because I mean, ultimately history is written based on what's inside the archive. And the photographs and films that are in the archive also have a lot to do with how we remember the war if we didn't experience it ourselves. So I'm trying to add these more polyphonic layers, I suppose, into how this war is basically remembered. I see this work also as I'm focused on this one war in Malaya, but I think this is true of so many wars in the decolonization period. And I think we're at the tail end now of being able to actually get live testimony from the people who fought in these wars. So there's a certain urgency as well in the work. Yeah.
There are 2 things here that I think are important. One is a quote by you that going through the different publications connected to the piece, you were saying this is a story as small and as large as one can make it, no? Like how these sometimes really situated practices are part of a general reading, so they help us to create like similarities between different conflicts all over the world. That was precisely what you were saying, and I think that's the richness of the project, that everyone can find, if this has happened here, it could have happened in any other conflict in any other part of the world. And then secondly, your working methodology that is not only archive-based. You have been interviewing many people that were related to your grandparent or people that took part on those conflicts. So how is the emotional process on making in these interviews people that have been silenced by their own families and by the same of the having lost, and the official narratives? How does it work?
So on your first question, I think those links, I do say that the story is as small as big as you want to make it, because sometimes people have, looked at me and said, oh, this is just about your family history. And I'm like, actually, it isn't. The family history is an entry point into something I hope is much wider and much more universal than that. And I think the connections are both geographic as well as temporal. I mean, I think that I'm looking at just Malaya, but like I said, this kind of conflict was replicated across the so-called global South when, when people were doing anti-colonial movements and wars. I mean, you can find so many parallels. For instance, direct parallels in Malaya and Kenya during the Mau Mau rebellion. I mean, there's so many different decolonization wars that carry a very similar narrative. So it's geographic. These links can be made geographically, but I also think I've become increasingly interested in the lineage of certain colonial practices over time. So it's also temporal. For instance, my grandfather was among at least 20,000 Malayan suspected leftists who were deported by the British during this conflict. And I see a lot of parallels between those practices of offshoring unwanted populations and what we witness today in terms of refugees and asylum seekers being offshore and palmed off on some islands, or, for instance, Britain's recent policy of sending asylum seekers to Rwanda. I mean, that kind of offshoring. I have seen documents, and this is research I'm doing for a future piece of work, where the British in the early 1950s were desperate to get rid of these suspected leftists from Malaya, and they were going through a laundry list of locations to dispose of them. And the language of disposal was present in the texts that were used to describe these people. So I see these parallels across time as well. So the piece really has, I hope, more resonances for a much bigger audience than just people who are interested in the specificities of the Malayan conflict. In terms of the methodology of doing oral history and the kind of emotional work that comes with that, I think I'm benefited from the fact that I'm, one generation removed from the actual war. So in fact, I'm kind of what some scholars would call the post-memory generation, because I didn't experience any of this myself. It's inherited memory that I'm kind of using and activating in order to do this work. So I'm a little more emotionally detached from it, and I also come to it with a kind of, I suppose, almost academic distance. So it's not so emotional for me, except when I do a very long oral history interview with someone who fought in the war. And I've mostly focused on what I call the foot soldiers of the war, because I feel that the leadership and various people of prominence in this war have had a chance to write their own memoirs, so they don't really need me to speak for them. So there have been times when I've, interviewed these people who were just really small participants in this conflict. And after maybe say like a 4 or 5 hour interview in their home, they will turn to me and they'll say, I've never told anyone all of this before. And they're in tears because of how emotional it is for them to relive all this. And and then I feel this kind of weight of needing to do justice to what I've just been imparted with. So there is a certain emotional kind of work that comes with it. Within my own family, there was a huge reluctance to talk about my grandfather initially. And then over time, through a lot of persuasion on my part, I kind of impressed upon his children how important it was to write this all down and record it some way. And otherwise it's just gonna disappear. So in fact, my oldest uncle then wrote a 50-page family history in English, kind of like for me. And so I've been using that to make some of the work from, but it's a good reference for me. Otherwise, I would have no idea about all the stuff that happened. And with all this other oral histories that I've collected, about 35 spread out over 5 countries now, because they all became exiled in different parts of southern China, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, and southern Thailand. I'm planning to make a book. The 3rd book of the series is going to focus on the oral history strand of the work.
And giving a place to those histories, because I think that's really important, like being listened and being, as you say, processed in a way that becomes public.
Yeah, I mean, for now, those oral histories live in the form of the songs that I've collected from these people. Right now, I have a 2-channel video work, which is of them singing the 2 specific songs that they remember from this conflict. And for now, that's how it exists. And also in exhibitions, I've done a long table of texts where some of these excerpts of the oral history interviews are present alongside colonial narratives of this war. So it's there in a kind of multi-perspective kind of piece of text. But I feel that the emotional work is present in the video installation because the songs are somehow, the songs take us into a space that I think the photographs and the films cannot somehow, and the texts cannot. Somehow song has this other power. And yeah, I mean, I think the affect of the remembering and forgetting the lyrics and the singing of, for instance, the Internationale in Chinese, it just carries a different emotional, it takes us into a different emotional space altogether from the other work.
And then now you are taking it, you've mentioned it before, the piece we are presenting on a stage is titled The Mountain That Hit. And it's taking it into a more speculative, imaginative path, where like you have gone through the archive, through the story, you have done these 10 years research, the story, and now you want to take it somewhere else and you want to make a proposition. In this sense, it's a 2-channel installation with 2 very different parts. So if you could unfold that and how you have imagined and how you are working towards the future with those materials you already have, that would be great.
Yeah, so the piece that I've made for stage, The Mountain That Hid, is a 2-channel video where I've paired videos made from actually different times. So perhaps it's easier to talk about the 2nd channel first. The 2nd channel is basically almost like a video love letter to the house in southern China that I found in 2011. That was built by my great-grandfather, and which my grandfather, upon deportation from Malaya, returned to and died near. So basically, he went back to the house, and then he joined the local Chinese Communist guerrilla unit to fight in the final months of the Chinese Civil War. And he was unlucky to be captured by the opposing nationalist Kuomintang soldiers, and they eventually imprisoned him and executed him near the house. So I discovered this house, after 62 years of nobody from the overseas part of the family returning, and I was just very taken with the fact that this is my ancestral house, and this is where granddad came back to die as well. And so I kind of made a almost very romantic video, love letter to it. But it's interesting because it's little scenes from the interior of the house. It's quite detailed footage, and I've kind of now spliced it into a kind of dreamy narrative. The first channel in the piece is from Singapore from 2021, and it is of an encounter that I had on a train track, which was built from British times. And I went there in search of traces of my grandfather's path. He was deported from Malaya via Singapore and put on a ship to China. So I was looking for pieces of his physical journey, and I came upon this train track. And I won't do a complete spoiler, but basically the video is of an encounter, kind of almost incredible magical encounter that I had on these train tracks on that one morning that I was there, which really spoke to me about the circulation of people and the Chinese diaspora. My grandfather had come from Hong Kong to Malaya and then was kicked back by the British for his political activities. And now in modern times, we have a different circulation of people from China coming to Singapore and Malaysia for a different reason. And I was interested in those circulations of diaspora, and it kind of really made me think about whether history takes place in circles or in a linear form. So I'm kind of interested in how things kind of repeat and echo themselves over time. So I put those two channels together, and why it's slightly more speculative is that it's not a document of anything from this war now. It's a work that has the Malayan emergency and kind of like the deep background, but actually the work itself doesn't speak to the war directly. And I think it takes us into a different kind of mental world. And I'm interested in doing that now because I've been digging through these histories and these traumas for the past several years, and I've increasingly felt like the past needs somewhere to go. So we can't just look at what's there. We need to have somewhere to go with these emotions and this information. So I'm right now creating more works that are about looking at processing what happened and looking at being in a slightly more, I suppose, dreamy space in those gaps between stories, between histories, between time periods. I'm looking for those gaps and trying to generate things or generate kind of emotions and questions almost in those spaces.
And those questions, who would respond to them? No, I mean, it's like, this is one of the things, like, would you imagine the power? I mean, how do you imagine like those questions, how they move?
I think everyone will find a different access point into those questions. I don't know if they can be answered. I don't know if they will be answered. I think people will find different things that resonate with them. So far, as I've done this work, and especially when I've done the performance lectures, I've had different people come and tell me that you know, such and such a thing really made them think about their own family history, or such and such a piece really made them think about their grandmother who, you know, was taken away and killed in the Holocaust. You know, so people find different access points from very different backgrounds and very different histories. But ultimately, can those questions be answered? I don't know. I mean, the overall title that I have for this entire project is One Day We'll Understand. And that is actually from an inscription on a gravestone of a Scottish soldier who died in this war. He's in a cemetery in Malaysia, in Perak, Malaysia. And I kind of was taken with this line that his family chose to put on his grave, because I intended to be multiple things. One day we'll understand. Is that a statement? Is that a question? Is that a proposition? Is that a hope? Is that a kind of wistfulness? I don't know. It's all of those things, actually. So there's an open-endedness about it. And on the gravestone, there is no full stop or question mark or ... behind it. So, I mean, I kind of think for me, it's a ... And so I don't know if those questions can be answered. I think we can just keep exploring and keep asking those questions. I think asking those questions is really important also.
I totally agree. And I want to thank you very much, because I think like with this, we have a very nice end to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Soledad. Yeah. And thank you to your team for working with me on this commission.